antisocial. Fear will cause you to do a bunch of things. Please hear what I'm saying. Okay? And this is how the gospel must be communicated, because on a propositional level, often the gospel is not explained in the depths of its impact on human beings at the psychological level. But I can tell you right now, something has happened to Christian that is profoundly revolutionary on a subjective level. He hasn't come into a classroom and taken a test and passed the test of understanding what the cross work is about. He's experienced the cross now. This is a real experience. Am I making some sense? So it's the kind of experience that for the moment, he won't be able to explain it on an intellectual propositional level, but he will know its power. What will Christian know? He will know that the cross has the power to liberate him from his burden. Are you guys hearing me? He will know this. He will know that the cross has the power to liberate him from a burden that was on his shoulders, that was on his back. He will also know that the cross has the power to liberate him from his burden, and the burden as an object is now being made to be distant from Christian, because it's not a burden that's just like sitting right next to him. That burden now is rolling away. Is it not? Is rolling away. So the thing that was identified with Christian's person, the thing that was gripping Christian's life, that was painfully impeding his hope and his joy, is now not only disassociated with his identity as a whole being, his person physically, his person psychologically, his person mentally, but now he is watching that sin be removed from him. Are you guys following me? Not only is he loosed from his sin, passively speaking, but his sin is loosed from him, actively speaking. Are some of y'all capturing that? All right, so before I go on, what I want you to understand is when the gospel is properly comprehended, the gospel gives the person who experiences its power at the level of relief, at the level of disassociation. It gives that person the comfort of being made distant enough from the sin so that that person is not fearful that that sin is ever waiting to once again associate itself with that person by grasping again on his shoulders and holding on to his back and once again being a burden. This is what Bunyan is wanting you to capture here. Are you keeping up with me? All right, so there's a ton of verses that come into play. The first is John chapter 8, verse 31. If you are my disciples, you will continue in my word. And you will know the truth, and the truth shall do what? So is not Christian experiencing freedom? And then Jesus said it in John chapter 8:36. Whomsoever the Son shall set free shall what? Be free indeed. Is Christian at this point experiencing freedom? Okay, so I want you guys to stay with me. Theologically, you need to know that freedom can never happen. Freedom can never happen for the guilty sinner until the guilty sinner is justified in the courtroom of God. Didn't we learn this Sunday, you guys? Didn't we learn in Romans chapter 5, verse 1, therefore being justified by faith, we have what? We have what? Y'all forgot already. It's called peace. Now, is not Christian experiencing peace right now? Is he experiencing peace? Right. Okay, so some of y'all know what it's like to have like a physical malady. Do you know what that's like? I mean, something that really, I'm talking about really, it took away your peace. Are you listening to me? It took away your peace. I am one of the happiest men on the planet for 1,000 different reasons, but here's one. Here's one. For about 30 years, I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that 30 years ago. I couldn't do that. I couldn't for about 30 years. I was 36 years old playing basketball. 34. And I messed up my hip really bad. And many of you guys who have been with me for years watched me walk with a limp because I was in so much pain. Do you understand what I just stated? And the pain was like a backpack of sin because it actually grew worse and worse. And it was only liberated during COVID because it was a time for all of us to shut down. And I had a good ortho who was willing to work with me, through all of the different qualifications, if you might say. And having come out of the pain of that burden, of my hip inflammation, bone on bone, everyday suffering in my sleep, couldn't sleep on one side. Some of y'all know what I'm talking about. It was a continual pain. And then to discover the pain being gone was like a dream. Because you're so used to the pain that when the pain is gone, you don't believe it. And this is where the gospel here in Pilgrim's language is, I saw in my dream. So this is Pilgrim's dream, but it's not a nightmare. Remember, we saw the one with a nightmare. This is a wonderful dream happening right now, is it not? It's a wonderful narrative of a radical release from a burden that this man was bearing that fundamentally shut him up to a fear of hell. And remember what Christian said early on when he talked to evangelists. He said, look, I don't want to die. That's one thing. I ain't ready to die. The other thing is I don't want to go to hell. Evangelist said, why are you in the field? He says, man, I'm struggling. He said, why? Because two things. I heard what this book says. It's appointed unto men once to die. I don't want to do that. And then after that, the judgment. I'm not ready for the judgment. Very honest, wasn't he? I told you, an honest person doesn't go to hell. An honest person doesn't go to hell. And so what we're experiencing here for Christian is a bunch of terms, and I really want to adumbrate what Christian is experiencing under the doctrine of justification. What you are watching here is called the experience of justification. Did you hear what I just stated? Now, it's justification imputed and imparted. Justification imputed and imparted. Imputed is when God accounts it to you. Imparted is when you experience it. When God accounts it to you, it's on your record. That's your standing. We talked about that. When God imparts it to you, it's in your conscience. It now becomes an experience for you. And Christian is now experiencing the benefits of justification. And the benefits of justification fall out in 5 categories. Justification leads to pardon. Because pardon is the outcome of being cleared from the guilt of the crime that should keep you imprisoned forever. Justification is the consequence of atonement. It's the consequence of propitiation. It's the payment made. It's the acquittal established on legitimate grounds. And when one is justified, acquitted, cleared of the crime, they must be pardoned. Does that make sense? So pardon is the legal term that corresponds with the psychological term forgiveness. So when a person is pardoned in the legal sense, they are forgiven. What does that mean? They are no longer held in court and suffering containment because they have won their case, they are cleared of their crime, and the judge now has to what? Let them go. So it's justification that leads to pardon. Pardon leads to forgiveness. That's the gospel, is it not? The forgiveness of sins. Forgiveness leads to freedom. Freedom is a consequence of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a consequence of pardon. Pardon is a consequence of justification. Please learn that because you're going to have to explain this. I'm going from the objective to the subjective, am I not? When a person is not justified, they're not free. When a person is not justified, they are not forgiven. When a person is not justified, they are not pardoned. You see what I'm getting at? And so what is Christian experiencing now? He's experiencing the liberation that comes with being justified. Romans chapter 6, we're going to walk through this just a bit. I want to keep this doctrinal for tonight. We're going to go into the deeper experience of sanctification next week. But I want you to capture what Christian experiences. This is Romans chapter 6. I'm going to start at verse 6 and see if we can actually work this through. This is Paul's explaining baptism. And baptism, once again, is the doctrine of Christ's crucifixion on our behalf and our crucifixion with him. I better start at verse 1 or 2 just because of some of our visitors. Look at Romans chapter 6:1. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? No, there's a solution. Verse 2, God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? That'll be explained. Verse 3, do you not know that so many of us as were baptized into Christ were baptized into his what? Into his cross. Because the cross is depicting the death of Christ. This here is going to come home in a minute for you. Baptism and the cross are synonymous, are they not? Luke chapter 12, 50, 51 makes that very plain. Jesus says, I have a baptism to be baptized with, and, how am I constrained till it happens? So baptism is unto death. Look at verse 4. Notice what he says. Romans 6:4. Therefore, we. You see that word? We. Not you or him, we. That's the first person plural. That's the doctrine of what? Union. All that he is, I am in him. All that I am, he was for me. So can you see yourself in the baptism? Have you been baptized? Then you have to own the we. This is how you understand your position. Notice what he says. Therefore, we are buried with him in baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we should walk in what? Is that what Christian is about to experience? Fully newness of life. Notice what it says in verse 5. For if we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, we shall also be in the likeness of his what? Resurrection is another term for life. It's another term for newness of life. It's another term for liberty. The resurrection is the liberty of the soul coming up out of the bondage of sin and death, okay? All these are synonymous and corollary terms. Verse 6, knowing this, that our old man is what? That's exactly what Christian saw when he looked at the cross. When Christian looked at the cross, he saw himself in Jesus. Did that make some sense? He saw himself in Jesus and went, whoa, I have been put to death. And what he's coming to understand is the sin that he bore represented his nature that now has been dealt with because God took his sin off of him and put it on Christ. That makes sense, right? And what Pilgrim is doing when he looks at the cross, which is what we're going to do on Friday, when you look at the cross as someone being called to Jesus, you begin to see yourself in Jesus and you begin to see the solution to your sin problem. This is absolutely astounding, is it not? I told you, the best way to know who you are is to know who Jesus is, if you're a Christian. And if you don't practice seeing yourself in Christ, you're going to have a difficult life. Because there'll be a lot of things about you that you're just not going to like. But if you can see yourself in Jesus, then you can see yourself down the line, the more new and improved you, okay? Got to do it by faith, okay? I'm just telling you now. You got to believe that you look better in Jesus. Knowing this, that our old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be what? Is that what just happened with Christian? I love this. This is a this is a courtroom term, and it is a legal contractual term. The word means to be disannulled. Christian had a contract with sin because he was born in sin. This is what we're going to learn in Romans chapter 5:12, right? By one man's sin entered into the world, death has passed upon all, for all have been constituted sinners in Adam, right? So coming into the world, you and I have a contract with sin. We're sinners. That contract is disannulled because Christ took up your controversy on himself and your sins were laid on him. And once you see it in the cross, you get a new contract that says justified. And you know it more than objectively. You know it subjectively. You go, oh, I am free. That makes sense, right? Let's keep going for a moment. Notice what he says, knowing this, that our old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, that henceforth we should not what? Be a slave of sin. Christian was a slave of sin. And something powerful that was happening to him. As much as he couldn't deliver himself from being a slave of sin, God's sovereign power was moving him in another direction anyway, was it not? Now, this is something I want you to capture as well, because the thing that you and I want to be able to do is explain what happens before salvation, unto salvation, at salvation, and after salvation. That's the whole point of the Pilgrim's Progress. It would make no sense if we didn't understand that Pilgrim was not yet converted until this moment, even though everything he went through because God was guiding him. God was guiding him in his sinfulness, guiding him in his corruption, guiding him in his fallenness, guiding him with the burden of his sin still on his back, was he not? This is what we call prevenient grace as well in theology. Is it possible that before God converts you, God calls you? Of course it is. Is it possible before he gives you a real dynamic of conversion that he deals with you in your life in a kind of pedagogical way as a father watching over his child before he gives him his inheritance, just kind of guiding him through the crazy of life? And then one day at the right time, in a very mysterious way, you actually call on God in a sincerity because you're acknowledging now, Father, my sin is too much for me. And boom, God liberates you. Does that make sense? Of course, it is the case. That's why it took us so long to get here, saints. And the joy that you should have in this consideration is God is often, how does the hymn writer put it? For you were forelong beforehand engaging my soul. This is an old Psalter hymnal expression. I sought the Lord, but afterwards I knew it was him seeking me as I was seeking you. For thou wert long beforehand dealing with my soul to bring me to the place where I come to know you as a child of God. Does that make some sense? And as a child of God, we get to look back and see how God watched over us all the years we were acting a fool. We're going to lock that down as we work through the angels. Because you know the angels getting ready to come and holler at our boy, right? They're getting ready to come and holler at our boy. I want you to understand that conversation. So this is extremely important. Going back to the vision, I got a little bit more to go before we stop. I want you to understand the beauty here. And as I said, what's happening with Christian is what is called the impartation of righteousness. Imputation is standing. Impartation is his transformation. So now he's going through a transformation. And listen to what it says under line number 5. Then was Christian what? And what? And said with a merry heart, he has given me rest. Now he gives you an insight as to the qualifier of his rest. And this is so important because what Christian is not about to do now, which is what a lot of people do when they don't understand the importance of what we would call the union of the believer in Christ. A person may want rest from their sin, but will not understand that rest from your sin means sorrow for the sin bearer. Look at the reading. This is the magic of the storyline. The magic of the storyline is this. Then was Christian glad and lightsome and said, with a merry heart, he has given me what? Rest, which is a consequence of freedom, which is the fruit of peace. But notice what he says. He has given me rest by his sorrow. His rest didn't come in a amorphous way. It did not come in the kind of vacuum of mystery. His rest was a direct consequence of Christ's sorrow. Man of sorrows, what a name for the Son of God who came, right? Ruined sinners to reclaim. Hallelujah, what a Savior. Hallelujah, what a Savior. Y'all got that? So what Christian is not doing in his confession is acting like Jesus doesn't matter. He has to matter. Christ has to matter. The cross has to matter. He's actually, and I love what Bunyan is doing. Bunyan is using what is called in language an ellipses, elliptical phraseology. And ellipses, I've told you what this is the inference of things there but not stated. That's what an ellipsis is. You can look it up in the dictionary later on. You're in class now. So This is what the idea means. When Bunyan is looking at the cross, he's not looking at an empty cross. He's looking at the cross with a man on it. And that man happens to be the Son of God. The cross cannot save you. It's the Christ on the cross that saves you. Y'all got that? Now, y'all can wear the necklaces all you want. I ain't got no problem with it. The cross doesn't save you. It's the Christ on the cross that saves you. So what Bunyan is doing is he's looking for the first time in a vivid way upon Jesus of Nazareth. See what I'm getting at? And I love that there's no description there, because you and I don't know what Jesus looked like. I told you he ain't a white man. Michelangelo did the best job he could, but Jesus wasn't Italian. He was Jewish. And he was probably Jewish from the farther end of the, Chaldean spectrum. That's going to change the complexion quite significantly. The point being is that we're not supposed to make an image of God, because we would distort who he is, because we would be just guessing. Am I making some sense? Right. Now, he's the visible Yahweh, and the brothers in the first century saw him, and notice that none of the apostles said nothing about his height, his weight, his stature, his complexion, his color, his tonation. Nothing about his features did they ever one time mention in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the book of the Acts, or the epistles. Are y'all hearing what I'm stating? This is profound, is it not? Because we have in all of the historical archives, all of the literature, Tacitus, Josephus, all of the literature, Herodotus, the writings of Pilate, a lot of the Roman archives, all of them admit that Jesus of Nazareth lived. You don't have one picture. That's a trip, isn't it? That's my terminology. It's a trip, because like all of us got pictures going back to being a little child, don't we? Like, one of the reasons we can know you exist, unless you're like an alien or something, is that we can go back and trace your pictures. You can't go back and trace Jesus' picture. There's not a vivid image of him, because the early Christians understood that he was the Son of God, and they understood Torah. And they understood that if they started painting pictures of Jesus, even though, remember what John said in John 1:1? We saw him, our eyes were set on him. We touched him, we handled him of the word of life. We felt him. John lay on his bosom. So John could have given very vivid descriptions of Jesus. Could he had not? I mean, John could have really embellished upon it and gave us exact clarification of his person at the physical level. And he did not, because it did not matter. It was who he was, not how he looked. And so it is here when Bunyan says that when Christian was glad and lightsome, and this is really interesting. We're almost done here, but I like this. Think about this. I don't know if it was really truly indicated, except in glimpses, what Christians' fundamental and prominent emotional attitude was from the time we met him in the opening of the book in the field, struggling with his sin, to now. Like, we don't get a whole lot about whether a Christian was glad and lightsome. We know he wrestled with a bunch of things. We know that he had some relief in attitude around certain things, right? Escaping worldly wise man. We know he was grieving a lot. We know he was troubled a lot. Y'all keeping up with me? We know he was anxious. We also know that when he came out of interpreter's house, he was thankful because he was informed. Remember what he said? I am so thankful that I learned these things. But we don't read anywhere where he was gladsome, where he was lightsome. Again, that's Saxon English. That's Old Saxon English. Glad and lightsome. Because he wasn't glad. He still had a sin problem. And he wasn't lightsome because that burden was so heavy on his back. How can you be lightsome when you're heavy laden? Are y'all keeping up with me? All right, so I'm going to share with you one more thing in the insight here. Christian was what Jesus was for him before Christian had his sin nature put on Jesus. Christian was burdened with his sin as Jesus was burdened with his sin. Man of sorrows, acquainted with griefs. Right? Man of sorrows, acquainted with griefs. We, as it were, hid our faces from him. God laid on him the iniquity of us all. Jesus was constantly burdened with our sin. That makes sense, right? So what we're being taught here is that our sinfulness was Christ's suffering. And if Christ's suffering was our sinfulness, if the condition of our sinfulness prior to salvation is that we don't know what gladness is until we're liberated, and we don't know what lightsome is until we're free from our burden, what we do know is what sin is in a small measure, and therefore we know a little bit about what Jesus bore because we share in that sinfulness. Does that make sense? It's important for you to know that. It's important for you to know that. So notice what he says. He has given me what? There it is. There it is. I wake up every day super happy. Get up, I can squat, I can do all kind of stuff. Right? Happy. Happy. I sleep at night. I can turn over on both sides. This has been 2 years now. And I'm still happy when I get up. Because it was almost 30 years that I had to get up in a certain kind of way and take my time to maneuver my way up and avoid the pain in my hip. Am I making some sense? Every day I get up thanking God for having a night's rest because of the freedom that comes with it. This is Matthew chapter 11:28. We'll pick this up further in 2 weeks. You've heard it. Come unto me, all ye that are heavy laden. Isn't that what Jesus says? Come unto me, all ye that are heavy laden. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy. Again, I know that word labor. Labor, when your body is not working properly, functionally, in harmony, when every part is not doing what it's supposed to do, not free to do what it's supposed to do, guess what you're doing? You're laboring. You're laboring. Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. The actual Greek grammar is, I will rest you. Not just give you rest, I will rest you. It's much more of you being God doing something for you, and then you going, whoa, that feels good. Does it make sense? Here's another Old Testament counterpart to it that's important to get, and this is where we will stop. This is going to be Hosea chapter 11, I think, on this part here. Hosea 11, I'm going to read verses 1 through 4, and listen to how the Old Testament text corresponds with what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11. We're going to come back there and close. I want you to keep in your mind rest, because rest is critical to a qualitative nature of life. I'm just going to make one more observation after we read this, and then we're going to close. Because when God saves you, he saves you for a qualitatively different kind of life. So you and I have to focus in on and understand that salvation is qualitative. Did that make some sense? Sure, it has a duration element to it, but it's far more than durational, because every human being lives forever. The saved and the lost live forever. The righteous and the unrighteous, the just and the unjust. When men die, they only die in their bodies. If they perish, they'll perish forever. There is a kind of life that they live. It's the life of damnation. Am I making some sense? So, when you and I are saved, we're called to a qualitatively different life. And you and I would want to identify those qualitative markers and make sure that we're not neglecting them. Because what you're going to learn when the angels come to Pilgrim, they're going to give Pilgrim a scroll with a seal on it. Do y'all remember that? They're going to give Pilgrim a scroll with a seal on it and say, Pilgrim, you on your way, read this and make sure you give this to the one that lets you in. Pastor, what is that? I'm not going to tell you till next week. But you want to know it. You want to know it. I mean, if the angel gives you a scroll, look, just take the scroll, okay? I'm just letting you know. He know what he's talking about. When Israel was a child, this is God speaking of Israel, then I what? I love this. This is so important. when Israel was a child, not only is he speaking about Israel when he was in bondage, when Israel was in bondage in Egypt, 1,500 years before Jesus. This would have been about 1587 BC. It was the time when Moses was called by Jesus, who was in the burning bush. That was Jesus telling Moses, go get my people. Tell them, let's go. Isn't that right? So the doctrine of let my people go is the doctrine of liberation. Did that make some sense? And remember what I told you? No liberation without what? Justification. So we understand the Exodus event is that a lamb had to be slain for Israel to be liberated. Do you guys remember that? Justification leads to liberation. Stay with me. But the burning bush is the time when Jesus shows up and tells Moses, go tell Pharaoh to let my people go. This is the way God is viewing Israel at that time. Israel was a what? A child. A child. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 18? Except you what? Become as a what? Little child. You're not going to enter into the kingdom. You're not going to enjoy the kingdom benefits. Right. So a child, unless he or she is tainted by trauma, has much more of a joyous perspective of life than an adult does. Would you agree with that? It's just stop lying. You've grown. You know life is a mess as an adult. It's really hard to enjoy childhood naivete and freedom as an adult. You know this is true. So what God says is Israel was at a time when they needed me, and they didn't mind acting like a child, because when a child needs their parents, they act like it. Notice what it says. And I loved him, and I did what? I called my son out of Egypt. Is that what God is doing with Pilgrim? Of course he is. Is that what he's done with us? Right. He's calling us out of Egypt. Notice what the next verse says. I want you to capture this. And as they called them, so they went from them. Do you guys see that? So this is interesting. I want you to capture what's going on. God is actually also talking about the struggle of people coming to God, the struggle of his children coming to God. I want you to capture this. I want to walk this out. Give me a few more minutes. When God is calling you to himself, all the other days are calling you at the same time. Did that make some sense? All of the pagan idols, all of the Egyptian gods, all of the structures that Israel lived in under Egypt. Do you think that Israel just said, woo, Jehovah's here, time to go? Or did it take over a year for God to destroy every one of the gods in Egypt? Which means destroy the gods in your eyes so that you stop valuing them equal to Jehovah or comparative to Jehovah. Am I making some sense? Often God has to do all that work to liberate you to come to himself before the cross and after the cross. So notice, as they came, so they went from them. They sacrificed unto who? Did Israel do that in the wilderness? As they came out, they're being called back to Egypt while God is calling them to the promised land, is he not? As God is liberating them, they're being called back to what? Bondage. Am I making some sense? Almost there. Notice what it says. And they burned incense to graven images. Now here's the true and the living God. He shows up in power. Remember, the gospel is the power of God and the salvation. He delivers Israel out of all of these false gods, but Israel is still struggling with worshiping idols. Nevertheless, what is God doing? He's still bringing them to their destiny. So God's power is overcoming their power. Is that true? That must be the case. That must be the case, child of God. Look at verse 3. I love this. Here's what God says. I taught Ephraim also to go. Again, remember what I told you. The work of the Spirit of God is to take you by the hand and to lead you. Is that right? And therefore, the metaphor is that he is the pater, the father, and you are the child. As children of God, we must be led by the Spirit. And so here he says, I taught Ephraim how to go. He was teaching Israel how to trust him as they navigated their way through the wilderness. Notice, taking them by their arms. That's a father, is it not? Come on, boys, we got to go. But they knew not that I had what? That's really paradoxical. That's really paradoxical. Don't want to be there long at all. It's just that often, even in the early stages of our salvation, we are not real clear what God has done for us. And while we are not clear as to what God has done for us, we can be inclined to be dubious and still seek other lovers for healing. Notice what it goes on to say, verse 4. This is what I want you to do. Hold on. Can you go back to verse 3? Verse 4 is the last one. I want to make sure I did everything here. Yes, I taught Ephraim how to go, so they did church. I taught Ephraim how to go, so they did church. It's called doing church. Y'all got that? Just called doing church. You know how to do church. You can look a certain way because you can do church. I taught Ephraim how to go, taking them by their arms, but they knew not that I had healed them. This is called pluralism. This is called syncretism. This is called ecumenism. It's when you will attribute to all kind of other things the blessings in your life rather than to the one true and living God from whom all blessings flow. Did that make some sense? Yes, indeed. You meet a bunch of Christians like that. All right, now notice what he says. Even though they did not know that I was the one to heal them. Verse 4. And here's the tenderness of our proposition. I drew them with cords of a man. Who is the man? Who is that man? Jesus. Jesus, right? Remember what Jesus said in John 12:31? If I be lifted up, I'll do what? I drew them with cords of a man. This is why we will worship Calvary night, looking to the one that drew us by the power of the cross, right? I drew them with cords of a man with what? Bands of love. There it is. Bands and cords are synonyms. So the man that he drew us with is the expression of God's love by which he bound us. That makes sense. Notice what he goes on to say. And I was to them as they that take off the yoke on their jaws. What does that mean? And I was to them the experience of liberation from being the slavish mule or donkey or ox of another master. Did that come home? You were working for another master. He had a yoke around you. And God came and took that yoke off. Not only did he liberate you from the yoke, but what did he do? He laid meat unto them. That's what God does for us in the gospel, does he not? He brings us to a point of freedom. He brings us to a point of rest. He also brings us to a point of feeding in order that we might be strong enough to actually serve him. All right, we're going to take a break.